Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll start with introducing myself. My name's Crystal. I am actually on the conference committee, conference planning committee this year. It's been really fun to be part of planning. This is actually my first time to help with planning and actually my first time to attend a conference. So I've learned a lot and it's been really awesome to be a part of this and meet new people. Like I said, I'm Crystal. I live in Texas. I have 3 kids. I have my oldest son is Sam. He's 11. My middle son is Ben. He is almost 8, and he has arid 1B CSS. And then my youngest is Emily, and she's 5. So first of all, I would just like to say thank you for everyone being here today. It's awesome to see y'all. Welcome to day 3 of the conference. I just think that I have really enjoyed the conference so far. Everything's been going really well, and I'm just so thankful that y'all are you are all here today. So I also want to say thank you to Jennifer. She will be presenting today on IEPs, and this is just a really important topic for anyone who has school-age children or anyone that will have school-age children, as everyone will probably encounter these at some point. So I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping things. This is day 3, so many of y'all have heard this several times already, but it's always good to just kind of go over everything. Everyone's going to be muted except for our speaker right now. If you do want to, when we do go to question and answer and you do want to ask questions, you are welcome to, and we can kind of get to that point. But I also want to tell y'all that there's going to be the chat option. So that's where we're going to ask for questions. That's where we're going to have people come in and you can type your question there. We are going to record these sessions. So if the speaker view will be recorded and it could be used in future social media things, but the gallery view will not be recorded. So unless you're speaking or unless you're actively saying something, you will not be recorded. If there is any inappropriate conduct, I don't expect any, but you'll be warned first and then you'll be removed from the conference. There's also English captions that can be enabled by clicking the button down at the bottom. We will also have an option for you to record for these recorded sessions to hopefully be available in different languages if need be. So the lobby room is still going to be open today. If you want to join the lobby room after the session, or if you want to join a breakout room, that is going to be available. And then also, we want to encourage you to follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages. If you do want to post pictures or anything like that, you can use the hashtags MyCSSFam and hashtag CSSConf2021. We also want to let you know that if you do want to get involved with the foundation, there's many volunteer opportunities. So please reach out to foundation@Coffin-Siris.org. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Jennifer Wayne-Weitz. She is the founder and president of JW Advocates. She received her JD from Boston University School of Law and her BA from Brandeis University. She practiced corporate and trial law for several years, perfecting her advocacy and negotiation skills. Ms. Weitz is the mother of 2 special needs children. She has experienced firsthand the overwhelming feelings of confusion and despair confronting parents when they first learn of a child's disability. She feels fortunate that her legal background and negotiating skills have led to success in her own children's education experiences and changed her career path to use her background to help others navigate the tangled web of special needs legislation. So with that, I would like to turn it over to her, and I hope you enjoy. And as I mentioned, put any questions in the chat box, and we will address those at the end of the session.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and for having me here. I also wanted to add on to that brief description of my background that I do have 2 children with special needs. They have Fragile X syndrome, which is not CSS, but does have a lot of similar symptoms. So it does cause intellectual disability, along with a whole host of other symptoms, ADHD, fine motor, gross motor, delays, and sensory issues. And it runs the gamut, almost anything that a child with autism would have, along with intellectual disability. So I'm well versed in almost all areas of disability based on my own children, and I have been practicing advocacy for many, many years now, so have exposure to almost every type of disability at this point. But today, what I wanted to do was run through the IEP document. I know that people here are from all different states. What I'm using as a template, what I'm sharing with you on the screen in a moment, will be the Connecticut IEP document, but the information found in this document is the same. While it might look a little bit different than the one from your state, is the same information that you're going to find in any state. So just apply it to the document that your state uses. So now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Oh boy, let's see. Where did it go? Okay. Okay. Can everybody see that? Crystal, are we showing the screen? Okay, great. All right. So this is just my information. My phone number is here. If at the end of the session, there's not enough time to get to your question, if you want to shoot me an email or give me a call, I'm always open to speaking with anybody, and I'm happy to give you whatever advice I can. Okay, so the first page is the IEP cover page. And everybody's IEP will have this page. It looks fairly simple, like something you really don't have to pay that much attention to, but there are a few items on here that I would really urge you to check as soon as you get your IEP. So you'll have an IEP. In Connecticut, it's called a PPT meeting. In most other states, it's called an IEP meeting. And at least 5 school days after that meeting, you're supposed to receive the IEP document. And this is the first page of that document. So you want to make sure that all of the areas on this first page are accurate. So the first thing you want to look at is the current homeschool. And that would be whether they're outplaced in a different school or not. That would be the school that would be in their homeschool district. Okay, and then the school next year is wherever you've agreed to place the student the following year, which could be different than the homeschool. You want to look at who's included in the actual meeting. There must always be an administrator or designee leading the meeting, and that person has to have the qualifications to actually be leading the meeting. And that means that they can make all decisions. And this is a big issue that I find when we're at a PPT meeting, or what most people would call an IEP meeting. I make a certain request, and the person designated as the administrator of that meeting says, oh, I need to talk to the supervisor of special education. I can't make that decision. Well, then they shouldn't be listed as the administrator. The person who is at that meeting must be able to make all placement decisions, all financial decisions. So you can really hold them to that. And that's a big point of advocacy. You don't want to give them the opportunity to then go back and have more discussions with other people about it. You've already discussed it. You don't have to come back to an IEP meeting for it. All decisions should be made at that meeting. If you look at the area that says, the next reevaluation date. So can you see my, Crystal, can you see my cursor or no? You can, okay. So here you have the name, the date of birth, the district, the date of that meeting. Make sure the date is correct. Sometimes it's wrong. I went over the homeschools, gender, case manager is usually the special education teacher. If you're in upper grade levels, it'll be one specific case manager, one specific special education teacher. Address, make sure it's correct because that's where all information will be sent. And the most recent annual review date is once a year you have an annual review. That date should be indicated there. And then they're going to put the date for the projected date for the next annual review date. And the annual review must be held by that date where it says next annual review date. Next projected PPT meeting date. If you talked about having a PPT a month later, you want to make sure that that's indicated there, that next month later date is in here. And here's where everybody who's present, oftentimes they'll leave out the other people where it says other over here. You want to make sure if you bring an advocate or an attorney that they're listed on that page. All right, this is the page that lists all of the recommendations that were made, this part up here at the PPT. Typically, before I end a PPT, and I apologize, PPT and IEP meeting are used interchangeably. Before I end an IEP meeting, I ask them to review the list of PPT recommendations. This is everything you've all agreed to at the meeting. So agreed to increase speech from 1 time per week to 3 times per week for 30 minutes. Make sure it is very explicit and tells you exactly the duration and how many times per week and whether it's one-on-one or individual or in group. Now this part right here, the PPT meeting summary, which would be an IEP meeting summary in some states, is optional. So the school does not have to put anything here, but most of the time they do. And it should be a summary of what happened in the meeting, what was discussed, and it has to be accurate. So while it's not legally required to be in here, if it is in here, it has to be accurate. And that means that if you read through it when you get it back, and the information is not what you discussed at the meeting, or if they left out critical information, you're going to want to write what I call an addendum letter after the meeting. And that would be you receive your IEP within 5 school days after the IEP meeting. And if you find anything wrong with it at all, including anything on the cover page and anything on any of the pages that we will discuss after this, you want to write an addendum, which basically just goes, thank you for meeting with me to discuss my child's placement or whatever it is that your, my annual goals and objectives, whatever it is that you've discussed at that meeting. I have the following, I have received the IEP document on X date. If it wasn't within the requisite time, then you want to make sure you point that out there. I have the following questions / concerns, and then just bullet point them. And one would be under PPT meeting summary, principal states, blah, blah, blah. And if that's not actually what happened, say what actually happened was blah, blah, blah. Now, I also recommend that you record all of your meetings, all of them. You do have to let them know that you're recording, and they will record as well, but that's okay. You want to be able to go back and listen to your recording to make sure that what you're saying happened and what you recall happening are actually what happened. So you just want to make sure that the information in here is very accurate and also that they didn't leave anything out. Okay, this is the most important page in an IEP, prior written notice. You'll see it as PWN in a lot of places. And this is where anything that you have asked to happen, so you want speech 3 days a week, and they say, no, we're not going to do that at this time, sorry. Okay, so the action proposed, if they proposed speech twice a week. That would be here. So speech proposed twice a week. And action refused would be speech 3 times a week. Now for action refused, they have to indicate their reasons for refusing the actions and what evaluation procedures, assessments, records, or reports they used as a basis for the refusal, and they have to be dated. So you want to really look at that carefully because that's going to give you a lot of information. If you asked for speech 3 times a week and they almost always say educational performance supports refusal, that'll be checked off. Well, what are they using to support that? Because if you have achievement testing and you have report cards and you have outside evaluations all indicating that your child needs speech 3 times a week, and they're checking it off here as a reason to support their refusal for 3 times a week, then you want to include that in your letter, that their reasons, their rationale for actions refused was not appropriate because, and then you cut and paste the sections of the reports that indicated that your child needs more than that. Any action you always want to state exactly at the meeting. Okay, I understand you're refusing my proposal. I want that indicated under prior written notice. If you don't ask for it, you may not get it. Okay, so they're supposed to put any refusal in, but they don't always do that. So you need to make sure that you explicitly ask for it to be indicated on the prior written notice page. Okay. Present levels of academic achievement. So here is where you have your chance to put in your concerns right in this section. And you also want to preface it by saying, my concerns are, and I would like this indicated on the parent concern section of the IEP. And then you want to put in, okay, my concerns are that X, Y, and Z recommended 3 days of speech for my student, and he is not making progress in goals 3 through 5. We are concerned and we would like an increase in speech. Okay, so I'm just using speech as all of the examples, but obviously this holds true for any concern you have. I'm concerned about lack of progress. Now, if you happen to say, and many people will because they want to show appreciation for the staff, and you should, but I really warn you against saying, I'm so happy with my child's progress. Now, if you say that, it will come up in this section. They will stick it right in there. Parent is thrilled with student's progress, okay? And that they will point to that over and over again to show, but you said you're so happy with their progress. So what's the problem? If you go to mediation or due process, that's going to come back and get you. Okay. Then if you look under this section, under area, to my notes on here, under area, you want to list all of the, anything. You want to list, all of the current, how your student is currently performing, and that includes testing scores. So if they had an evaluation done and you have a whole list of testing scores, you want them to be included in this section right here. You also want to make sure that where this little box is checked off, if your child, you want to make sure it is not checked off if your child is not age appropriate in that area. So for example, in language arts, if your child scores below average and has goals and objectives for reading and writing, this age appropriate box should not be checked off. Very frequently, I see the box checked off and then I see concerns listed here. If there are any concerns listed on this document, on this page, then this box should not be checked off. Okay, and as I mentioned, all of the present levels would go, current testing scores and presently what the student is doing, go under the area comment. Strengths is pretty clear cut. It's whatever your child's strengths are. So if answering literal questions in nonfiction books is a strength, they'll write that there. You want to make sure it doesn't just say answering literal questions, because if they can't do it in a fiction book and they can do it in a nonfiction book, making a general statement like that isn't accurate. So you want to make sure that it would specifically say answering literal questions in nonfiction books. So you want to be as explicit as possible. And the reason is, under concerns, every concern that's listed in any of these columns here, there has to be a corresponding goal and objective. So this is really the basis of the IEP. This is where the goals are formed. So you absolutely have to make sure that every concern that you have is notated here and that it's explicit enough to create a true and accurate goal and objective from it. Okay. Now, this goes behavioral, social, communication, other. A lot of people are concerned about what goes under other. And other would be anything that there isn't a column for. So for example, if they did cognitive testing and your student came out with a very low processing speed, it would have the scores for the cognitive testing. So IQ of 78, relative weakness under concerns for processing skills, because that's relevant, and you want to make sure that there is a goal and objective, or at least accommodations and modifications that are going to cover that concern. Okay, transition planning. So transition planning applies for students who are 16 and over. If you have autism, and many people have dual diagnoses of different genetic syndromes and autism, it would be, at least in Connecticut, 14 and over. So this actual document is pretty explicit. You want to make sure that all of the areas are filled out appropriately. When you have transition planning happening, you want to look at, so these services are based on student strengths, preferences, interests, and needs, and must be considered in planning post-school outcomes. So this page really talks about the different assessments that were performed to determine what a student's interests are, what their goals are, their short-term goals, their long-term goals. So if that student is planning on entering vocational work or a day program or a 2-year college or a 4-year college, whatever it is that the post-school outcome is for that student, you'd want to indicate it here. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the transition planning right now, because that could actually take an entire other session. But if anybody has specific questions about it, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. Okay, goals and objectives. This is another really important page. I think I've said that for every page, but this one you really want to pay attention to. You see the column up here that indicates what type of goal it is. Is it cognitive, academic, self-help, social behavioral, employment, communication, independent living, and so forth? You want to make sure that they've checked off the right area up there. And then you're going to have a goal, okay? And the goal has to be a measurable goal. And that is really, really critical, because if it's not measurable, there's no way to figure out whether your student is making progress or not. And if you're looking for outplacement, or if you're looking for more services, you need to show that the current program is not working. The current program is not providing your child with FAPE, which is a free and appropriate public education. So you have a measurable annual goal, and they really, what a measurable annual goal will do is estimate expected outcomes for the student within the academic year. So within that year, you want them to be able to master that goal. Okay, they can also be, they are usually measured by these short-term objectives. So you have a broader goal, and then you have short-term objectives here. The objectives should be also measurable, and they need to be measurable in terms of data. So if you look here on the side at evaluation procedure and performance criteria, these align with this section down here. Okay, you see 1 through 12, and then you see A to J. I always want to see quantitative measurable goals. So that means that I like to see data collection. So there isn't a section right in here under evaluation procedures that specifically says data collection, but most schools will click other and write in data collection if you request that. And then under the performance criteria, you would want to see, you would want to see E, frequency/trials. Okay, so that way you can go back and say, show me the data and show me how many times he was able to do in the number of trials that are indicated on under the objectives. So for example, the measurable annual goal might be that, say reading, Joey will answer comprehension questions on text at his instructional level. So you'll probably get something. Joey will answer comprehension levels on text. So you might get that. You want to look at it and say, how many questions does he have to answer and what level text are we talking about? Are we talking about grade level? Are we talking about his independent level? Are we talking about instructional level? Because it makes a difference when you're trying to measure whether these goals are mastered. And then you go down to the objectives. And so he's answering comprehension questions. What kind of comprehension questions? Are they literal questions? Are they on fiction or nonfiction? Are they inferential questions? So you want to go through and make sure that each objective is 100% measurable. And 100% reminds me that when you're looking under measurable annual goal, when it says percent trials, etc., right here, there's often a lot of confusion in different districts. And so if under the objectives, they have to master or perform appropriately that objective 4 out of 5 times, often the district will write 4 out of 5 up here. But that's not what this line is for. This line is if there are 3 objectives, how many of those objectives have to be mastered in order to master the goal? So I always wanted to say 100%, because a goal, in my opinion, is never mastered until all of the objectives are mastered. Because you can have short-term objectives leading up to the final objective that you need for mastery of that skill. And if you master the ones leading up to it and not the final objective, which actually is the skill you would like your student or child to achieve, you haven't really gotten anywhere if you need to have all of them mastered. So 100% under that section. Okay, accommodations and modifications. I think most people are familiar with this page, whatever it looks like in their own IEP document. There's a clear difference between accommodations and modifications. And I like to just think about it simply that an accommodation is something that levels the playing field. If your child has ADHD, preferential seating and alternate test setting might level the playing field for that student. Modifications, however, actually change the information, the type of work, the instruction. So for example, modified assessments. Now you're actually changing something. You're not actually just leveling the playing field. So when you have a 504 document, you can only really put in accommodations, but here in an IEP, you can put in accommodations and modifications. So when you're looking at this page, you have to know that the district always has to consider assistive technology. Consider does not mean that they have to use it, but they have to consider using it. So if you ask for something like an AT consult or an AT evaluation, and the school has never discussed it with you and they've never considered using it, you have to have a discussion about it. Okay, and they should at least do a consult for AT or trialing it. So there are different ways they try to get around an evaluation. The best thing is to have a comprehensive AT evaluation. But if you can't get that right away, ask for a consult. Ask them to trial different programs. Just do whatever you can do until you can show that that comprehensive AT evaluation is a necessity. I'm not going to go through each. I think it's sort of self-explanatory, each section of the accommodations page. What is not as self-explanatory is this bottom section, the frequency and duration of supports. And this is where supports that the staff might need in order to implement the student's IEP would be indicated. For example, teacher training specific to a student's diagnosis, and that's going to be important for something that's rare. For example, for my students, I would bring in experts in Fragile X syndrome and have teacher training programs for all of the staff. So I'm sure that a lot of parents with students with CSS would like to do something similar, since it is a rare disease that the teachers would probably not have familiarity with. Or parents can do it on their own as well. If you yourself have become an expert, which I'm sure most of you have, you can do a staff training on your own. This is also where something like para support in the classroom would come in, consultation by a special education teacher or a related service provider. So when you put in para support, it's important also, a lot of times it'll say as needed. And I don't like anything to say as needed, because who makes that determination? You want to put, you make that determination at the IEP meeting, and you put in specific language pertaining to it. So if your child needs a para 100% of the time, you want to write paraprofessional support one-on-one throughout the school day in all academic and non-academic areas. You want to make sure that if they really need it everywhere, that they're getting it during their related services, their specials, transitions, gym, whatever it may be, lunchroom, because unless it's specifically written there, it may not happen. And it likely isn't happening unless it's written there. Just going over to this column here, the site/activities where required and duration. So what's important about that section is you want to make sure that it's listed where in the duration. So not just in all classes, you want to write all classes all year. Okay, so if they need organization help, whatever it might be, color-coded folders. Here it would say in all classes. You want to make sure it says in all classes all year, not until they deem that they don't need them anymore 3 weeks after school starts. The whole year is when they need these. So again, if there are additional questions about this, I'm happy to answer them at the end. State and district accommodations. These are going to be different for every state, but it's just standardized testing. So in Connecticut, we have 2 different standardized tests. All states have different ones. Some of them are time restricted. So a student who requires extra time would have to have that indicated on this page. A student who can't read, maybe a student with dyslexia, would want text to speech as an accommodation on this page. So whatever the actual statewide or district-wide assessment is, you want to ask questions about it, such as, is there a time limit on that? Where will my student take this? Will he or she take it with everyone else, or will he have an alternate setting? Can he use a calculator? Is there a calculator embedded in this test? Or do we have to make a special accommodation for my student to use a calculator? So you want to ask those questions. Okay, this page is a page that a lot of people overlook, but if your student has any type of behavioral difficulties and requires an FBA or an IEP, which again are 2 things that I could spend days talking about, but very briefly, an FBA is a functional behavioral assessment. Any student that has been suspended for 10 days or longer, the district is required to conduct an FBA. But for other students who haven't been suspended, when there are behaviors that are interfering with their education, and by education, I mean not just academics, but academic, social, emotional, behavioral. So it encompasses all of that. If there are behavioral issues, then the school should do an FBA. Sometimes they bring in an outside board certified behavior analyst, a BCBA, Other times they use the school psychologist. I always prefer bringing somebody from the outside in who has new eyes on your child. But that's an argument to be made at the meeting. But if they require an FBA, you really want to fight very hard for that, because what that will result in is a behavioral intervention plan, which schools typically call a BIP. And that plan will be used uniformly, should be used uniformly and cohesively throughout their day by all staff working with them, and requires data collection. So you can get a clear picture of, is my child's behavior improving? If it isn't, what do we have to do? What do we have to change now? Is it the environment? Is it an instructional technique? Does he or she need a sensory diet? What is it that we need to change? The FBA, the functional behavioral assessment, will take what's called ABC data, and that's antecedent behavior consequence. So you want to look at what's happening before the behavior happens. What is the behavior, and how did the teacher or whomever is with the student respond to it? Are they getting some sort of reinforcement from behaving that way? If so, you want to get rid of that reinforcement. Are they only acting that way when there's a loud noise? What happened to precede the behavior? So it's a great document to have. It's an evolving document, but if your child has behavioral issues, you want to make sure that the school is addressing them properly through positive behavioral interventions, and that they're receiving a behavioral intervention plan. So right here at the beginning of this page, it says for students, number one, for students whose behavior impedes his or her learning or that of others, the PPT has considered strategies, including positive behavioral interventions and support to address that behavior. So it's either not appropriate or a behavior intervention plan has been developed. If this is checked off, there really must be a behavior intervention plan. Oftentimes I look at IEP documents and this is checked off, yet the entire file doesn't contain an IEP, a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. Sometimes there are IEP goals and objectives that are developed to address the behavior, but there's no behavior intervention plan. In my opinion, if the behavior is significant enough to create a goal and objective, then there should be an FBA and a behavior intervention plan to support those behaviors and to help decrease them. Here, it's for students with limited English proficiency. The PPT, that's the IEP meeting, has considered language needs. That's either checked off as a recommendation or not appropriate. Blind or visually impaired. These are easy to understand, deaf or hard of hearing. A critical piece here is progress reporting. A report of progress toward meeting the measurable annual goals and short-term objectives included in the IEP will be sent to parents periodically according to the following schedule: quarterly, consistent with grade level report cards, or other. You want to look at that and make sure that you're actually receiving the progress reports in accordance with the IEP. Most districts will write consistent with grade level report cards. So if you have more than one child and one of your children receives their report card and your child with CSS does not, and doesn't get a progress monitoring report, you want to check in with the school and find out where that is. And the progress report is all of the IEP goals checked off as either satisfactory progress, mastered, unsatisfactory progress, or limited progress. And you want to look at those scores and figure out if you've had the same goal and objective in your child's IEP for 1, 2, 3, sometimes I see 4 or 5 years of the same objective with limited progress every time. What can we do to change things, right? Is this the appropriate environment for my student? What type of instruction does he or she need? Exit criteria is just when the student will exit special education. It says age 21. It's in Connecticut. They just changed it to age 22. But if you have a child with significant needs and you feel they're going to require the school district's support until age 21 or 22 through transition programs, vocational programs, you want to make sure that they didn't put graduation here, that they put age 21. Okay, oop. Did I just move on? Okay. Services page, another important page. So special education services, in this column, it would indicate what the actual service is. The goal numbers are here. You want to make sure that every goal in your IEP has a corresponding special education column filled out here. So if you have 10 goals in your IEP, 1 through 10 should be listed right here. If they left one out, then nobody's working on that goal or objective. Okay, so you want to make sure they're all indicated here. Frequency, you want to make sure that that's correct. Reading / writing, goal number 2, 45 minutes per day in a 6-day cycle. Responsible staff. The responsible staff has to be somebody who is capable and certified to actually deliver that instruction. Okay, the service implementer can work under the responsible staff. So for example, the responsible staff can never say instructional assistant or paraprofessional, because a paraprofessional always has to work under the direction of a teacher. Okay, so more often than not, I see responsible staff, special education teacher, comma, instructional assistant. Well, that instructional assistant cannot be teaching your child. It cannot be in charge of teaching your child. They can be the implementer. They cannot be the instructor. All right, the start date and the end date, you want to take a careful look at that, make sure that it's aligns with what was agreed to in the IEP. It'll be a year. The site is listed as the regular classroom, the resource room, a self-contained classroom, community-based or other. So that should be listed here. And this is important over here because if you agreed to individual services and it says one-on-one / small group, you want them to get rid of the small group because you agreed on individual. Related services, same thing, follows the same grid lines. ESY also has to show up on the services page in accordance with what was agreed to. ESY is extended school year. That's usually the summer program. Oh, sorry. Okay. The total school hours per week and the special education hours per week and the hours per week that the student will spend with students who do not have disabilities should be also filled out properly. Typically, they're not. So you want to make sure that you know exactly how many hours per week your child is spending with typical students versus other students with needs. It's kind of where the least restrictive environment comes in. So your student is entitled to receive their education in the least restrictive environment, which according to the IDEA, the least restrictive environment means that a child must be educated in the classroom where he or she would attend if he or she did not have a disability. Special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So if you want your student in the classroom with general ed students, and you can use things such as a para and behavioral supports and a modified curriculum, that can be done in the mainstream classroom. So you don't want to have your child moved out of the mainstream classroom into a more restrictive environment without first trying supplementary aids and services. And that is the end of the slideshow. So I am ready to start taking questions whenever you are.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was a lot of information, but all very good. So I will just start with our, list of questions that are coming through, and I will just encourage anyone and everyone to ask questions in the chat. If you do want to ask a question, you want to come on and unmute, let me know, and then we can do that. So. Okay, the first question we have here is my son's he's 3 years old. His first IEP is coming up, and I want him to do everything, of course, but I struggle to put that in measurable goals. So his key goal right now is speech and communication, and also to keep learning preschool academics like shapes and colors, etc. So that sounds like maybe some recommendations of how to, in that first IEP, how to make those goals measurable, and kind of what to do for that first meeting.
So that first meeting is prior to that first meeting, the school will have done testing. So typically they will do something called the Battelle. They'll do this is for a young child. They'll do adaptive skills. So that's also activities of daily living. So you want to go through the documents that were the testing that were either performed by the school, or perhaps you've had an independent evaluation done and the school has accepted that instead of doing their own testing. But either way, you want to look at those documents, look at the recommendations, if there are any, and look at the areas of deficit. So you want to go through the testing. Most of the tests average is between 85 and 115. So if you see that your student's score falls below 85, most likely that's a below average score. I'm generalizing because there are so many different tests, but I mean, you can look at the actual report and they should tell you what's below average, what's well below average, what percentage your child falls in. And you want to look specifically at subtests. Where was the area of weakness? And then you want to identify that as an objective. So say we're looking at speech, and maybe it's an articulation goal. So the goal would be that student is able to appropriately pronounce TH. Okay, and then each objective has to be measurable. So what are the steps to appropriately pronounce TH, right? So student will, and I'm just making this up, I'm not a speech therapist, but be able to perform the tongue movement that is required to make the T sound or the Th sound, and so forth. But you want to make sure it's measurable, which means that he has to be able to do it 4 out of 5 times across all environments in the school. You can make it measurable in a multitude of ways. You might want to say as observed by his paraprofessional, or as observed by in a structured speech setting, he can do it 4 out of 5 times. It's whatever point you're up to in his development. But the most important thing to do at that first meeting is to make sure that all suspected areas of disability have been analyzed, examined, and evaluated. And then you want to make sure that every area of need is worked on. So don't let the district say to you, your child has so many needs, we can't write a 30-page IEP for him. It's just not going to happen. And you have to say, yes, every area of his disability had to have been notated on that present levels page as a concern. And therefore, we need a goal and objectives addressing every area of need. Now, you can't be unreasonable and say, okay, my child's 3 years old and the end goal is I want them to read at a 12th grade level. No, you want to make sure that they, for example, know the letters of the alphabet, or what sound they make, or whatever it might be that you feel is appropriate and the school deems to be appropriate for the end of that school year. Every goal and objective should be mastered by the end of the year in which it was written. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Yes, I think that was a very good, thorough answer. The next question we have is, I'm seeing for person responsible, general education teacher, special education teacher, staff. Is that appropriate?
So it depends. Is there a line after, so gen ed / special ed, this is for person responsible. It's hard to know without a little bit more information, but / staff usually would not be appropriate. Staff can be anyone, right? Anybody on staff at the school. So I would ask to get rid of the staff, or to ask exactly what is meant by staff, and if it is appropriate for staff. So for example, if it was a speech goal and they're saying that the special ed teacher, the general ed teacher, all staff, and the speech pathologists are going to be responsible, that might be okay, because then the staff is implementing the goal throughout the school day. But typically what you want to see on a related service is that the speech and language pathologist is the responsible party, and the service implementers are the teachers, the staff, and the speech and language pathologist. So I would just ask a few more questions about that to the school. But the other thing with that is the general ed teacher. Again, without having more information, it could be inappropriate to have the general ed teacher listed as the responsible staff if it's a goal that pertains to the special education services. So for example, if it's a reading goal and the student's being pulled out for reading and having, group or individual outside of the general ed classroom, the special education teacher should be the responsible person, not the general education teacher. So a few questions have to be asked before I can give a really appropriate answer. But I would just parse out what they mean by staff and how the general ed teacher is going to be responsible for a special education teacher's goal.
Okay, thank you. So the next question we have is, can you speak to IEPs in general? At what point do you make the leap from a 504 plan to an IEP? And then should we keep doing an IEP if we have moved our kids to private schools?
Okay, so the first part of that question is, at what point should you make the leap? And that is when we discussed earlier the difference between an accommodation and a modification, when accommodations are no longer sufficient to even the playing field. So if your student is not making progress in school, educationally, meaning socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and academically, with the 504 document alone, then it's time to look at an IEP. An IEP is a legal document, a 504 is not. So a 504 does not have goals and objectives. There's no real way to measure progress. They're not mandated to have any type of goal or objective that would measure progress in a 504. So an IEP is always a better thing to have. In terms of whether the school would grant an IEP, you have to have one of the 15 different areas of disability that was on the cover page. And that disability must be adversely affecting your education. So and by reason thereof, you need special education. So if you can't show that, then you wouldn't be able to get an IEP. But if you can show that, then you can get an IEP. And I would say the point when you want to consider that is when the 504 is no longer sufficiently meeting your child's needs. There was a second part to that question. What was the second part?
She asked about keeping the IEP when they've moved to a private school.
Oh, okay. Yes. So when you move to a private school, you're no longer governed by the federal laws. The IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is a federal law. So that only applies to public schools. So when you move to a private school, And I assume by a private school, you're not talking about like a state approved private special education school, which would be considered an outplacement school. I assume you're talking about a private school that's purely and completely private from special education. And in that situation, the IEP would not go with you. So that is the biggest issue for parents of students with special needs. Sometimes the really small classroom sizes are very appealing in a private school, but you have to know that you are giving up your rights under the federal law to an individualized education plan.
Okay, thank you. So the next question we have is, my son is 25. He was on IEPs since preschool. How long do I need to keep all his IEPs? He's not on SSI and may never qualify. Would saving these be useful?
That's an interesting question. I would say I would probably save the last 2 years because the fact of the matter is you're probably not going to need them anymore if he's 25, but you may have a day program that wants to see his IEP. You can always get it from the school district again, but if you have the last 2 years, at least you can just pull them out to show the program. If you do end up needing any sort of state assistance, they would likely want to see his final IEP. So it's probably beneficial to keep the last 2 years, but I certainly wouldn't keep them from his entire education. And again, if you want to get rid of them all, you can always make what's called a FERPA request to the school district, which is a request for all of your students' educational records.
Okay. The next question, how do you address potty training, toileting on an IEP? My son will be starting Gen Ed kindergarten with a one-on-one next year, but I'm not sure how or if to address his needs at his upcoming IEP meeting.
So absolutely, yes. Potty training can and should be included on the IEP. It's an activity of daily living. So there should be specific goals and objectives relating to toilet training on the IEP. I don't know what stage he's at right now, but they can go from, unfastening a button on pants or pulling down pants, pulling down pull-up effectively, and go all the way through to the washing hands schedule of washing hands, whether, he's doing it for 20 seconds and appropriately drying his hands. So you have to start at the point that he is right now. So perhaps he can already pull down his pants and sit on the toilet. So you want to talk about appropriately wiping as one objective, appropriately refastening and redressing in an appropriate time frame. Again, turning on the water, adjusting the temperature, washing under the faucet for at least 20 seconds or for the ABC song or whatever it is that you and the team decide on, turning off the water and drying his hands, throwing away the paper towel and re-entering the classroom appropriately, and also how much support he's going to need from the para for all of that. So that should absolutely be included in the IEP.
Thank you. I know that was a huge concern for me when my son started, so I'm glad that they add that in there. So the next question is, I'm also new to IEPs. Do you recommend working with a JD like you or someone similar to help navigate and advocate? Who should we be looking for, i.e., what kind of background or experience? Are there other resources or supports that would be helpful?
Okay, that's a lot of pieces to that question, but the first one is, my favorite kind of client is the one who walks in with a 3-year-old who is transitioning out of early intervention and first entering the school district, because you avoid so many pitfalls when you first start off your education with an advocate or an attorney. You know exactly what you're talking about. You know how to read the IEP. A good advocate or attorney will know how to decipher the evaluations, will know if appropriate evaluations were performed, and will know how to craft measurable goals and objectives. So yes, I would recommend that you do contact an advocate or an attorney prior to the first IEP meeting, if possible. I'd have to say the majority of my clients do not do that. They wait until there is an issue with the school, there's some sort of disagreement, and then they reach out to me. But it's certainly much easier to avoid any type of disagreement when you know from the get-go that you are doing everything appropriately and asking for all of the things that your child requires and having them appropriately marked on that prior written notice page as refused so that that can be used down the line in mediations or due processes. So the other question I believe was what you should look for. For advocates, there is no type of training required to become an advocate, which I think is incredible and hopefully will change. But you want to look for someone with a lot of experience. I always think it's important that it's somebody who has their own type of experience with special needs, with some sort of relative, or they were a nanny or babysat for somebody with special needs, or they have their own special needs children. But experience is key, and it's critical. Finding somebody who has experience working with your specific school district is always helpful. I find that it's easier to navigate a district when you know the players. I think, was there another part to that question?
There might have been, but I want to go ahead and let everyone know that we are at a little bit after the hour, so we can stay on. We do have a couple more questions that are coming on, but I do want to let everyone know that the next session, I believe, is a siblings social. So if anybody does need to or want to jump off, they can do that. And also, we are going to have the lobby, so we can continue to talk about this in the lobby as well, by clicking the link to the opening ceremony. So I believe we can continue to ask questions here, but like I said, if anyone needs to jump off, that's fine. And let's see, the other part of that question was, where are there other resources or supports that would be helpful? So
yes, I would definitely recommend, it depends on the state you're in, but there are many in Connecticut. There's there's certain ones for autism. There's certain ones through the state. There are parents who get together to do special education PTAs and special education PTOs. I would just look on your state gov page and you'll probably find a whole listing of them. Here there's PATH, there's CPAC, just so many different resources for families. Some of them will offer favor. I know will offer you a free advocate, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Typically, they don't have the time or resources to devote a tremendous amount of time to each of their clients, but it's definitely a good starting place.
okay, thank you. There is a question about, how should we ask for the IEP draft before the meeting? How many days in advance can we see the draft?
Yes, so I always ask for a draft, but typically I'll ask them for proposed goals and objectives at least 3 days prior to the meeting. Now, unfortunately, there is not a regulation stating that they have to comply with this, but if you've made the request, 99% of the time, the district will supply you with that so that you have a few days to ask any questions. It makes the process of the IEP meeting go a lot quicker and smoother if you've had the opportunity to ask your questions ahead of time. So at least 3 days prior.
Okay, so this is the last question that I have. It's pretty lengthy, and I'm not 100% sure. on what this is. So I'll read it, and if you need more questions, or if you have more questions, let me know. This says, could we touch on IWARS, IWARS? My 10-year-old just completed this transition. She scored just above the ID requirements, but she has severe language delays. The school confirmed they will approve ID as primary disability and speech language as secondary. I had them note CSS and ADHD as impacts. Is there anything specific I should see in the IWAR so that ID doesn't come up as her score was above cutoff? Her testing completed was the nonverbal IQ testing. Previous testing scores were attempted with verbal tests were inconclusive.
Okay.
I hope you understand that.
I'm just looking at what IWARS is. Unfortunately, it's not a Connecticut term. So I'm not, it's IWARS. It is not something I'm familiar with, but I assume it's some type of evaluation that a district in another state must be using. So the question is if she's performing or he's performing below level and they're giving the IEP. What is the actual question? What was the last part? What was the actual question?
Let's see here. It says, she said, is there anything specific I should see so that ID doesn't come up as her score was above cutoff? Her testing completed. So it sounds like on the IQ test that they tested above the score.
Okay, understood. So yeah, yes, okay.
It's the integrated written assessment report.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So it's not the actual evaluation. So whatever state that person is from does a written report afterwards that indicates all of the scores of the testing. So basically for intellectual disability to fit that category, you have to fall below a 70 or below on the IQ, but you also have to have delays in ADLs, which are activities of daily living. So I would say if you first of all look at the criteria for intellectual disability, most states have a checklist. In order to fall within each category, there's a checklist of where your child must fall. So I would ask the district to provide this parent with a checklist or go on the state government page and find a copy of that checklist and make sure that their child fits the criteria of intellectual disability. If they are not falling with an IQ below 70 and they don't have activities of daily living delays, then they can't have a primary disability classification of intellectual disability. So if you're concerned about that classification and they have more than one disability, I would say it's more appropriate to look at multiple disabilities as the disability.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it says she does meet the requirements, but the score was 76. That's what she commented with.
Okay, so the requirements are 70 or below. So if the score is 76, she wouldn't meet the requirements for intellectual disability.
Okay. Okay. This said with variance of 4 points. So I'm sure that is very close, right? That's probably hard to deal with.
Right, but they do draw sort of they draw a hard line there because that's also the cutoff for receiving state services for a lot of people with developmental disabilities. So, if the state's going to do it and you're not going to be able to receive appropriate services through the state because you're not intellectually disabled when you have a 71 IQ, the school can't turn around and in reverse say you are intellectually disabled with a 74 or 76. So it's definitely going to be an argument, but I would be very clear about multiple disabilities being more appropriate, as she also has speech and language or he, as well as it sounded like ADHD. So that would be more appropriate.
Okay. She says that she does get state services, and it could, oh, so the higher score could then cut off her services. That's the comments that she's
Oh,
stated.
okay. Then she needs to get an independent evaluation. That would be my next. So without, I know we're getting into one person's personal story, but I would say right now, if she's going to lose the state services and get an independent evaluation, explain that she could lose state services with this higher score, and you want her retested to make sure that this is a valid representation of her skills.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions coming through the chat right now. And like I said, we are a little bit over time. Jennifer, if you're, if everybody's good and everybody has gotten their questions answered, I think that we are safe to say that this session is coming to an end. Like I said, I do encourage you to go to the lobby if there are any more questions. And I know Jennifer did provide an email, so if there's any further questions, you can definitely reach out. And I just want to say thank you again to Jennifer. Thank you for everyone that attended, and just thank you for everything you've done. That information was great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.